Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The galaxy was a vast expanse of stars, inhabited by countless species, each with its own customs, ideologies, and sense of survival. Among them, the greedy tribe of the Zalathians stood out. They were known for their ruthless pursuit of resources and their insatiable hunger for power. Feared by all, their reputation for exploiting weaker species was legendary. No one dared to cross them, and no one sought to help them, not even the Galactic Council, a governing body made up of the most powerful civilizations in the universe. But when the greedy tribe's latest campaign to expand their territory resulted in a devastating famine, the Zalathians found themselves on the brink of extinction. As their vast empire crumbled under the weight of their own avarice, the once mighty tribe faced an impossible decision: beg for aid or perish. In a moment of rare desperation, the Zalathian leaders sent an unprecedented message to the Galactic Council, pleading for assistance. The council deliberated for days, as many of its members felt little sympathy for the greedy aliens who had exploited so many. However, a small faction within the council, led by the human ambassador, Captain Evelyn Locke, argued that even the most corrupt species deserved a chance at survival. After intense debate, it was decided, against the wishes of the majority, that the humans would be sent to help the Zalathians. They were the only ones capable of reaching the desolate homeworld in time. Captain Locke, a seasoned leader of the human crew aboard the Odyssey, had no idea what she was about to face. The Zalathians were not just any alien species. They were proud, fiercely independent, and notorious for their cruel treatment of others. As she prepared her crew for the mission, Locke's mind raced with doubts. How could they offer help to a species so steeped in greed and selfishness? Yet, the mission was clear. They had to deliver resources to the Zalathians and help stabilize their environment before it was too late. The Odyssey was ready for departure. The human crew consisted of experts in various fields: engineers, diplomats, biologists, and military officers, all handpicked for their ability to handle whatever the mission might demand. The atmosphere aboard the ship was tense. No one knew exactly what to expect when they arrived at the Zalathian homeworld, but the crew was unified in one thing: they would not allow their mission to fail. "Prepare for launch," Captain Locke ordered, her voice steady but filled with the weight of what was to come. As the ship's engines roared to life, she took one last glance at the stars before them. It was a long journey ahead, and no one aboard knew the true extent of the challenges waiting on the other side. The Odyssey's journey took several weeks through the vast, uncharted territories of the galaxy. Along the way, the crew endured long shifts and endless hours of uncertainty. But the looming dread of what awaited them upon arrival kept their focus sharp. Upon reaching the Zalathian homeworld, the crew was shocked by the desolation that greeted them. The once thriving planet now resembled a graveyard of cities, with vast stretches of barren land and broken infrastructure. The Zalathian cities, once symbols of their power, now lay in ruins. The once proud buildings were nothing more than skeletal remnants of their former grandeur. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the crew descended through the dying atmosphere and landed at the Zalathian capital. The people of the greedy tribe emerged from their hiding places, gaunt, ragged, and suspicious. Despite their dire circumstances, their pride still held firm, and they showed no signs of gratitude or humility. The air was thick with hostility as the Zalathians viewed the human crew with a mix of suspicion and disdain. A council of Zalathian leaders, led by the formidable Queen Kira, met with Captain Locke. The Queen's demeanor was cold and calculating, her eyes sharp with intelligence, but beneath the surface, there was a clear desperation. She was unwilling to admit the extent of her people's weakness, but the famine was undeniable. Her people needed help, but asking for it was beneath her. "You've come to deliver your resources, but you must understand something," Queen Kira stated, her voice low but commanding. "Our tribe will not kneel. We will not beg for your help. We will survive. By any means necessary." Captain Locke nodded, understanding the challenge she faced. The Zalathians were not easy to manipulate, and their pride made them a dangerous force to be reckoned with. But the humans were here for one reason: to save them, and Locke was determined not to let the mission fail, even if it meant dealing with the tribe's defiance. The crew quickly discovered that simply delivering resources would not be enough to save the Zalathians. Their planet's ecosystem had been ruined by years of overexploitation, and the famine was a result of their refusal to acknowledge the importance of sustainability. The Zalathian leaders were too proud to admit they had brought this disaster upon themselves, but they were willing to take whatever the humans had to offer, provided they did not have to compromise their dignity. Captain Locke and her team began working tirelessly to introduce new agricultural techniques, using technology from Earth to terraform parts of the planet and cultivate food. But it quickly became clear that the Zalathians had no intention of cooperating fully. They demanded resources without offering anything in return, and their leaders made it clear they would never lower themselves to the humans' level of cooperation. Tensions began to rise as the human crew struggled to make progress. The Zalathians were difficult to work with, and every attempt to foster goodwill seemed to backfire. Yet Captain Locke knew there was no turning back now. The survival of the Zalathian people depended on their ability to set aside their pride and accept the help they had long refused. But the question remained: would the tribe's greed and arrogance be their undoing? As the Odyssey's landing ramp slowly descended onto the cracked earth of the Zalathian capital, the crew braced themselves for what was to come. The once thriving metropolis was barely recognizable. The towering spires that had once housed the affluent now lay in ruins, reduced to smoldering skeletons of steel and stone. The planet's atmosphere, once thick with pollution and industrial fumes, now hung in the air like a fog, suffocating and toxic. The ship's sensors had detected the presence of Zalathian life, but the readings were unstable. A handful of their species were scattered across the wasteland, scavenging what little they could from their crumbling cities. It was clear the planet's resources had long been drained, the environment collapsing under the weight of the Zalathians' unchecked greed. Yet, despite the devastation surrounding them, the people still held on to their pride. Captain Evelyn Locke's boots crunched against the dry ground as she led her crew down the ramp, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Beside her stood Lieutenant Commander Tobias Gray, the ship's tactical officer, and Dr. Lila Trent, the ship's lead biologist. Both had been essential in preparing for the mission, though neither expected the severity of what they were now witnessing. "I didn't think it would be this bad," Gray muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The look on his face was one of grim realization. "We've only just arrived," Locke replied, her voice steady. "We're here to help, and we'll do whatever it takes to ensure they survive. But we need to stay focused. The people here are dangerous, but they're desperate." The human crew wasn't the only one on edge. As the humans disembarked, the Zalathians slowly emerged from their hiding places, their eyes watching with calculated wariness. They wore tattered clothing, their skin a deep purple hue, marked with the scars of a harsh life. Their gaze held a blend of pride, suspicion, and resentment, emotions that betrayed the devastation beneath the surface. Despite their hunger and suffering, they had not abandoned their sense of superiority. At the forefront of the Zalathian delegation stood Queen Kira. Tall, with long silver hair and sharp features, she exuded an air of regal arrogance even in the face of their dire circumstances. Her eyes, pale and icy, locked with Captain Locke's as the two leaders sized each other up. "Captain Locke," Kira said, her voice as cold and calculating as the steely glare she directed at the human leader. "I trust your people understand that we did not request your help out of weakness. We sought your assistance because the Galactic Council demanded it. But make no mistake, we do not need charity." Locke's gaze was unwavering as she met the Queen's icy stare. "I'm not here to offer charity, Queen Kira. We're here to help you save your species. If you want that, then we need to work together." For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension thick in the air. The Zalathians looked on, waiting for their queen's next move, while the human crew stood at attention, silently prepared for whatever came next. Kira finally broke the silence with a sharp nod. "We shall see if your methods are as effective as your promises. I trust your technology is as advanced as you claim." Dr. Trent, who had been standing quietly beside Locke, stepped forward, holding a small device in her hand. "We've brought technology that can help restore the soil, purify the water, and stabilize the atmosphere," she explained, her voice calm but firm. "But we need your cooperation to make it work. Without it, there's little we can do." The Queen eyed the device suspiciously but made no comment. She turned her attention back to Locke. "You'll be allowed to do your work, Captain, but know this. You are not in charge here. My people will not bow to anyone. You will deliver your resources and leave when your task is complete." "That is the agreement." Captain Locke nodded, accepting the terms with a subtle sigh. It was clear that cooperation would be far more challenging than anticipated. She had expected resistance, but the Zalathians' pride and arrogance were stronger than she could have imagined. They would not make it easy to save them, not without a fight. As the two leaders exchanged glances, a low rumble echoed in the distance, shaking the ground beneath their feet. A storm was brewing on the horizon, one that matched the turbulence in the hearts of both humans and Zalathians. The next few days were a blur of activity. The human crew worked tirelessly, setting up advanced systems to filter the air and water, trying to repair the damage caused by the Zalathians' reckless expansion. But their efforts were met with resistance at every turn. The Zalathians refused to accept any help that would diminish their pride. They resisted using the new agricultural techniques the humans offered, opting instead to cling to their old methods, which had long since failed them. Captain Locke spent much of her time negotiating with the Zalathian leaders, trying to convince them to change their ways. But every conversation seemed to circle back to the same issue: the Zalathians' refusal to accept their role in the catastrophe they had caused. Even as their people starved and their cities collapsed, they would not acknowledge their past mistakes. Meanwhile, Dr. Trent and her team worked around the clock to stabilize the planet's environment. Using Earth-based technology, they started planting genetically engineered crops that could withstand the harsh conditions. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. However, the Zalathians barely seemed interested in the progress being made, their focus more on maintaining their dignity than ensuring their survival. "Captain," Dr. Trent reported one evening as Locke surveyed the ongoing work, "we've successfully planted the first wave of crops. If the weather holds up, we should see results within a few weeks." "That's a relief," Locke said, though her voice betrayed a hint of frustration. "But it's not enough. We need to get the Zalathians on board, or all of this will be for nothing." "I'm afraid they'll never admit they need our help," Trent said, shaking her head. "But perhaps we don't need them to." Locke raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We can still help them without their full cooperation," Trent explained, her eyes brightening. "If we focus on helping their planet and providing for their people directly, without their interference, we can still make a difference. We may not win their hearts, but we can save their world." Locke considered this for a moment. It was risky, but it might be their only option. The Zalathians were proud to the point of stubbornness, and trying to force them into cooperation might only escalate tensions further. "We'll do it your way, Dr. Trent," Locke said, her voice firm with newfound resolve. "Let's save this planet, even if they won't thank us for it." The days following Locke's decision to bypass the Zalathian leaders proved to be both exhausting and exhilarating. The human crew began focusing all their efforts on rebuilding the planet's ecological systems without directly involving the prideful Zalathian leadership. They worked in secret, setting up autonomous farming systems, water purification plants, and air filtration units in the regions where the need was greatest. But this came at a cost. Tensions between the Zalathian people and the human crew escalated. The Zalathians were not accustomed to being ignored, especially by species they considered inferior. While the human efforts were quiet and efficient, they weren't entirely hidden. Captain Locke knew that their actions would soon be discovered, and the question wasn't if the Zalathians would retaliate, it was when. Dr. Trent, along with her team of biologists and engineers, worked around the clock to accelerate the restoration of vital resources. They introduced genetically engineered crops capable of growing in the depleted soils, used advanced nanotechnology to purify the planet's toxic atmosphere, and deployed solar-powered desalinators to turn the polluted ocean water into fresh, drinkable water. But despite their success in these areas, It became increasingly clear that their work would remain incomplete without the cooperation of the Zalathians. They could not repair the entire ecosystem on their own. Even if they fixed the environmental issues, the Zalathians would remain unaware of the long-term sustainable practices required to keep their planet viable. Eventually, the restored systems would collapse again, unless the people embraced a new way of thinking. Captain Locke had to make a choice. Continue working in the shadows and risk provoking the Zalathian wrath, or reveal their progress and attempt to break through the stubborn pride that had kept them from truly helping their own people. One afternoon, as Locke sat in her quarters, reviewing the reports from her crew, she received an urgent communication from the Zalathian capital. Queen Kira herself had requested a meeting. Despite the underlying tension, Locke agreed to meet with the Queen, knowing that this moment could either mark the breakthrough they needed or be the beginning of their downfall. Upon arrival at the palace, Locke and her team were escorted through the grand, albeit crumbling, corridors. The remnants of the Zalathian Empire were on full display, ornate marble floors cracked, once pristine walls now covered in dust and scorch marks. Queen Kira awaited them in the central throne room, her regal demeanor unchanged by the disarray surrounding her. The contrast between her cold, commanding presence and the ravaged world outside was stark. "Captain Locke," Kira said, her voice sharp and clipped, "I trust you have some explanation for the work your people have been doing on our planet." Locke stepped forward, standing tall and unwavering. "Your Majesty, we have been trying to help. Your people are suffering, and despite your pride, I believe we can save your world. But we cannot do it without your cooperation. You may not like how we've gone about this, but we did what was necessary to give your people a chance." Kira's gaze narrowed, and for a long moment, she simply studied Locke, as if weighing her words. "You assume we are weak, that we do not understand what it takes to survive. We are not so far gone that we cannot still command respect. You should not have acted without consulting us first, Captain. Your actions have insulted me." "I didn't mean to insult you," Locke said calmly, "but you're at a point where pride won't help you anymore. Your planet is dying, Queen Kira. If you want to save your people, you need to let go of this obsession with dominance." The Zalathian Queen was silent for a long time. Then, with an almost imperceptible shift in her posture, she spoke. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps we have overestimated our ability to continue without change. But I will not bend. I will not allow myself to be reduced to a supplicant." "We're not asking you to kneel," Locke replied firmly. "What we are offering is the chance to rebuild, not just the land but your people. If you refuse to change, the next generation will suffer. You don't have to lose your pride. But you do need to accept that the world you built is crumbling, and it will take humility to repair it." Kira's eyes flashed with anger, but behind the fury, Locke saw something new. Perhaps it was the beginning of understanding, or perhaps it was sheer desperation. "You speak of humility," Kira said. "But what if the very act of accepting your help is an insult to my people? What would it say about our strength, our legacy?" "Strength is not measured by your ability to conquer," Locke responded. "Strength is measured by your ability to endure, to change when change is needed. Your people don't have to lose their legacy, but they must evolve." The Queen's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. For the first time, there was a flicker of something akin to recognition in her eyes. "Perhaps you are correct. But know this, Captain Locke. If my people are to survive, it will not be because we bowed to another species. It will be because we stood tall, even in the face of extinction." Locke nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that evening, Locke gathered her crew and shared the results of her meeting. The Queen had agreed to allow the human team to continue their work, though she insisted that the Zalathians would handle the final stages of recovery themselves. It was a compromise, but it was progress. Queen Kira had finally acknowledged that something had to change. "We may have our foot in the door," Locke said to her team, "but it's not enough. They need to be involved in the rebuilding process, and we'll have to push harder to make sure they follow through." Dr. Trent spoke up, her voice determined. "We'll keep doing what we can on the ground. We'll continue restoring ecosystems, building infrastructure, but will also focus on teaching the Zalathians sustainable methods. It's the only way to ensure this doesn't happen again. The next few weeks would be critical. Locke knew that the battle for survival was far from over, and the true test of whether the Zalathians could overcome their past greed lay ahead. But for the first time since their arrival, there was a glimmer of hope. The Zalathians had accepted the reality of their situation. Now, they would have to choose whether to rise above their flaws or let them destroy everything they had once built. The next few weeks on the Zalathian homeworld were a delicate balance between cooperation and tension. Captain Locke, though cautious, could feel the first stirrings of a shift within the Zalathians. Queen Kira had made it clear that while the Zalathians would no longer outright reject the humans' aid, they would not allow themselves to be seen as weak or subjugated. It was a fine line to walk, but Locke knew it was their best chance to ensure the long-term survival of the Zalathian people. The human crew worked tirelessly to implement the final stages of their environmental restoration efforts. Dr. Trent and her biologists had successfully introduced resilient crops capable of growing in the Zalathian soil, which was once too barren to sustain life. The air purifiers and water filtration systems were making noticeable progress, and the temperature regulation devices designed to combat the planet's extreme climate shifts were slowly taking effect. But the real challenge lay in shifting the Zalathians' mindset. While the environmental restoration was progressing, Locke knew that if the Zalathians were to truly recover, they had to understand the importance of sustainability, cooperation, and long-term planning. The people who once ruled with a mentality of immediate gratification and conquest had to learn to plan for the future, something their culture had never prioritized. Queen Kira, while still outwardly resistant, had begun to attend some of the meetings with Locke and Dr. Trent, listening with a growing sense of unease to the discussions on ecological balance and resource management. The Queen's stoic silence in these meetings was a testament to the internal struggle she was facing. She had built her empire on the notion of control and dominance, and the idea of allowing outside influence into the future of her people was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, despite herself, she could see the evidence of the human success. The crops were growing, the air was cleaner, and the rivers were once again flowing with fresh water. One evening, as Locke and her crew were reviewing the latest progress reports, a sudden transmission from the Zalathian capital interrupted their work. It was from Queen Kira. Her tone was sharp, as always, but there was an edge to it that Locke had not heard before. "Captain Locke, I wish to meet with you." Alone, the Queen's voice crackled over the comms. Locke exchanged a glance with her crew. It was unusual for Kira to make such a request. But after the past few weeks of careful diplomacy, Locke knew this might be an opportunity to gain more ground in their efforts. She nodded to Gray and Trent. "Prepare for the meeting. I'll go alone." The palace was silent when Locke arrived. The once grand hallways, lined with gleaming marble and intricate stonework, now appeared dark and hollow, their majesty faded. The only sounds were the distant hum of the ventilation systems and the faint echo of her footsteps. When Locke entered the central throne room, she found Queen Kira standing at the balcony, looking out over the desolate landscape below. "Captain Locke," Kira said without turning around, "you've made progress that I did not believe possible. The crops, the water purification systems, it's all working. But there is something I need to understand. You came to help us, and now I must ask, why? Why would you help a people like mine? One that has only taken and never given." Locke took a moment before responding, her voice calm yet filled with the weight of the truth. "We came because we believe no one should be condemned to destruction, no matter what they've done in the past. The Zalathians are a proud people, and that pride has led you down a dangerous path. But your people are capable of so much more. We're here to show you that." Kira turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "And what if my people refuse to change? What if we decide that your help is an insult, that we would rather perish than adapt to your ways?" Locke's gaze softened. "That's a choice only your people can make. But you don't have to make that choice. We've shown you a way forward, a way to heal your planet, to rebuild your society. It will be difficult, and it will take time, but it's possible." The silence between them stretched, the weight of Kira's internal conflict evident in the tension that radiated from her. For a long moment, it seemed as though she might reject Locke's words entirely. But then her shoulders sagged slightly, and she looked down at the floor as though ashamed. "You are right," she said quietly. "We have always taken without thinking of the consequences. We have exploited the galaxy, consumed everything in our path, and now we face the consequences of our own greed. My people, they will never forgive me for what we've done." Locke stepped closer, offering a gesture of reassurance. "They don't have to forgive you, Kira, but they need to see that you're willing to change, that you're willing to put your people before your pride. That's the first step. The rest will follow." Kira met her gaze, and for the first time since they'd arrived, there was a glimmer of something softer in her eyes. "Perhaps there is hope for us after all," she said quietly. "But it will not be easy. My people will resist as they always have. But I will do what I can." Locke nodded. "That's all we can ask for. Change is hard, but it's the only way forward." The Queen stood in silence for a moment, then slowly nodded. "We will begin working with your people, Captain Locke. We will teach our children the value of sustainability, of cooperation. It will take time, but perhaps it's a lesson we can learn." As Locke left the throne room, she felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had reached a turning point, one that could either result in the Zalathians' redemption or their complete destruction. But the Queen's words were a start, and Locke would not let them fade into the past. Back on the Odyssey, the crew had made significant strides in their efforts. The Zalathians had agreed to allow the humans to lead the restoration efforts, but they insisted on a more active role moving forward. The changes had begun, but Locke knew they still had a long way to go. The next few days were filled with new strategies for collaboration. Workshops were held, where the Zalathians learned how to implement sustainable farming techniques, how to manage resources more effectively, and how to rebuild their cities with respect for the environment. At first, there was resistance. Some Zalathian leaders balked at the idea of relinquishing their control, but gradually more and more came to realize that the humans were not conquerors, they were teachers. Though the path ahead was long and fraught with challenges, Locke had finally begun to see the flicker of a future where the Zalathians could live in harmony with their world once again. It would take effort, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope for them yet. The winds of change swept through the Zalathian capital as Captain Locke and her crew continued to navigate the delicate process of rebuilding. The days of secretive environmental restoration were behind them, and now they were actively working with the Zalathians to teach sustainable practices and resource management. The initial resistance was strong, but Locke had seen a shift, however small, in the Zalathian leadership. Queen Kira's agreement to cooperate with the humans was one thing, but seeing the results of their combined efforts was slowly earning her people's trust. Yet, even as progress was made, challenges remained at every corner. Zalathians were proud, and their cultural identity had always been intertwined with their desire for dominance. The scars of their previous exploitation, however, had started to show. There were still those who clung to the old ways, the way of consuming and conquering without regard for the future. The tension between old and new ideals was palpable. The human crew knew their work was not done, and Captain Locke, ever the pragmatist, understood that one misstep could undo all the progress they had made. Every success came with a price, and while Kira had agreed to collaborate, her influence over the more rebellious factions of her people remained a constant concern. One morning, as Locke oversaw the implementation of a new irrigation system in the southern region, she received an urgent message. It was from Dr. Trent, who had been working alongside the Zalathian biologists to introduce more resilient plant species to help stabilize the soil. The message was brief, and its contents made Locke's stomach twist in knots. "Captain, there has been an attack on one of our work sites. Several human engineers have been taken hostage by a faction of Zalathians who reject the restoration efforts. They've been demanding that the human crew leave or they will execute the hostages." Locke's blood ran cold as she immediately called a meeting with her senior officers. The room was tense as the crew gathered, their faces grim with the news. "We've been expecting something like this," Locke said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There are always going to be factions who resist change. But this is different. We can't afford to let this escalate." Lieutenant Commander Tobias Gray spoke up, his voice low but sharp. We've kept a low profile, focused on the humanitarian side of things, but this is clearly a direct challenge. If we don't act now, we risk not only the safety of our people but the delicate balance we've been trying to build with the Zalathians. What are our options? Asked Dr. Trent, her brow furrowed. Do we give in to their demands, or do we take a stand? Locke paused, weighing the options. If they complied, they risked losing all credibility with the Zalathian people. If they acted aggressively, they could lose the fragile trust they had built with Kira and the other leaders who had begun to see the value of the human efforts. We'll negotiate, Locke said finally, but we'll do it on our terms. I want a team ready to move out. We'll send a diplomatic envoy, but we'll also have backup in place in case things go south. As Locke and her team made their way to the location of the standoff, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The rugged landscape around them, once a symbol of the Zalathian strength, now stood as a reminder of what had been lost. The decimation of the planet's resources, the looming destruction of their culture if they did not change. Locke had come to care for these people, even with their faults, and she knew that if they could just break through the walls of pride, they had a chance at a new beginning. When they arrived at the compound where the human engineers were being held, a heavily armed faction of Zalathians stood guard. Their faces were stern, their bodies rigid with defiance. They wore the traditional combat armor of the old regime, a symbol of their belief in strength above all else. Captain Locke, one of the rebels, called out, his voice thick with disdain. You and your people have no business here. Leave and we will release your people. Refuse, and we will not hesitate to make an example of you. Locke stood tall, her eyes locked on the rebel leader. We're not going anywhere, she said firmly. We came to help, and we're not leaving until our people are safe and your world is healed. I understand your anger, but this isn't the way forward, the rebel leader sneered. You speak of healing, but it is too late. The Zalathian Empire is dead. We are all that remains, and we will not let you destroy what is left of our pride. Behind Locke, her team was on high alert. They were ready to act if necessary, but Locke held her ground, her voice steady as she addressed the rebels. You think this is about pride? No, it's about survival. Your people are dying, and it's your pride that's keeping you from seeing the truth. If you want to rebuild, to have any future at all, you have to let go of the old ways. The world you once knew is gone. But there is hope if you allow it. The rebel leader hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with something like doubt. But it quickly faded, replaced by the cold, unyielding resolve of someone who had long since closed their heart to any form of compromise. We will not bow to you, he spat. Not to you or your false promises. Take your people and leave. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a voice rang out from behind Locke. It was Queen Kira, flanked by a group of her loyalists. Enough, Kira commanded, her voice booming with authority. This ends now. The rebels looked at their queen in shock, disbelief etched across their faces. You would side with them? One of the rebels asked incredulously. Kira's eyes narrowed, her voice cold but resolute. I side with survival, not with stubbornness. You would lead us to extinction with your pride. I will not let that happen. Locke stood frozen, watching as the tension between the factions reached its peak. She had hoped that Kira's influence would be enough to stop the rebellion, but she hadn't expected the queen to step forward so decisively. It was a turning point. The rebel leader's shoulders sagged, and with a harsh grunt, he motioned for the captives to be released. We will never forget this, he said, his voice filled with resentment. Kira's gaze softened slightly. Remember this, there is no strength in destruction. The future of the Zalathians lies in unity, not division. With that, the standoff ended. Locke exhaled deeply, relief washing over her as the human engineers were freed. But even as she celebrated the momentary victory, she knew the true battle was just beginning. The winds of change had begun to stir on the Zalathian homeworld, but whether they would carry the planet to a new dawn or cast it into darkness remained uncertain. The victory at the compound had been a moment of triumph, but Captain Locke knew it was fragile. The rebellion's defeat was not the end of the struggle. It was merely a turning point. The Zalathian people had shown their capacity for change in the face of destruction, but Locke understood the deep-rooted pride that had defined them for centuries. The scars of the old ways could not be erased overnight, and the work was far from finished. In the days following the standoff, Queen Kira's position became even more precarious. While some of her people had accepted her decision to collaborate with the humans, others were deeply entrenched in their belief that they should fight for Zalathian dominance, not compromise with foreign species. The political landscape of the Zalathian Empire had shattered, and now Kira faced a fractured society on the brink of civil war. Locke and her crew continued their work alongside the Zalathians, focusing on repairing the planet's ecosystems, building sustainable infrastructure, and teaching the Zalathians how to manage their resources more effectively. But even as they made progress, the tension between the reformers and the old guard intensified. Locke had anticipated resistance, but the level of hostility was alarming. Dr. Trent's team, working in the southern regions to establish new farming systems, reported a rise in sabotage. Equipment was stolen or destroyed, and critical infrastructure was damaged. It was clear that certain factions of the Zalathian population were not content to merely resist. They were willing to take extreme measures to protect their way of life. Locke sat in her quarters, reviewing the latest reports from the surface, when Lieutenant Commander Tobias Gray entered the room. His expression was grave, and the weight of his presence was enough to shift the mood. "Captain, it's getting worse. The sabotage is escalating. A team of engineers was ambushed this morning. No casualties, but we're starting to see a more organized effort to disrupt our operations." Locke nodded, rubbing her temples. It was only a matter of time. These factions are growing more desperate. They feel cornered. We've been keeping our distance, but we can't let this spiral into something more violent. "We need to show them that we're not the enemy," Gray said, his tone firm. "I agree, but we can't keep playing defense forever. We need to find a way to break through to them, get to the heart of the rebellion." As Locke pondered their next steps, an encrypted message came through. It was from Queen Kira. The transmission was brief, but its contents sent a ripple of tension through the room. "Captain Locke, I need to speak with you. It is urgent. I fear the situation has reached a critical point. My people are not all in agreement. I ask that you come to the capital immediately." Without hesitation, Locke gathered her team and made her way to the capital. Her mind raced with possibilities. What had changed? Had the old guard staged a coup? Was the rebellion about to spiral out of control? Upon arrival, she was escorted to the Queen's private chambers. Kira was seated at a large, circular table, her posture regal but her expression strained. The tension in the room was palpable, and it was clear that the Queen had not called for this meeting lightly. "Captain Locke, thank you for coming," Kira began, her voice betraying the exhaustion she must have felt. "I have called you here because I fear my people are no longer willing to follow me. The factions that oppose our alliance with the humans are growing stronger, and they are gaining support among the military." Locke's heart sank. "Are you saying the rebellion is about to overthrow you?" Kira nodded, her face grim. "It's a real possibility. The military leaders who once supported me are now divided, and the old guard is rallying around the belief that we must reclaim our dominance in the galaxy. They do not see the value in cooperation. They see it as weakness. Do you still have control over the people who support you?" Locke asked, her mind racing through the implications. "I have some loyalists, yes, but not enough to guarantee victory in a civil conflict. If it comes to war, we will lose. The people will be torn apart, and the planet will never recover. I am asking for your help, Captain Locke. I need the humans to stand with me, to show my people that there is another way forward." Locke sat back, weighing Kira's words. The choice before her was not an easy one. If she sided with the Queen, she would be taking a political stance, directly aligning the human crew with the fragile authority of a monarch whose reign was crumbling. It was a dangerous gamble. But if she refused to act, the Zalathian people could be plunged into civil war, and the progress they had made would be lost. "We'll help you, Kira," Locke said after a long silence. "But we need a plan. We can't just take sides in a civil war without a clear strategy. If we're going to prevent bloodshed, we need to show your people that the humans are not the enemy. We need to make it clear that the future lies in cooperation, not in conflict." Kira's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, she appeared vulnerable. "I do not wish for war, Captain, but I do not see another way. If my people continue to resist, I fear the path we're on will lead to destruction." Locke stood up, determination settling in her chest. "Then we'll find another way. We've been teaching your people how to rebuild their planet. Now it's time to teach them how to rebuild their society. We can't just rely on your influence, Kira. We need to bring the people together, to show them the truth of what we're building." In the following days, Locke and her crew worked tirelessly to put their plan into motion. They began organizing a series of public forums where both the reformers and the opposition could voice their concerns and ideas. Locke believed that dialogue, not force, was the key to averting disaster. The Zalathian people, however, were deeply divided. Many of the old guard were determined to overthrow Kira, convinced that their survival depended on reclaiming the traditional ways. But Locke remained firm in her resolve to unite them, using every resource at her disposal to facilitate peace. The days that followed were tense, as both sides prepared for the inevitable showdown. The fate of the Zalathian people, and perhaps the future of the human alliance, was on the line. The Queen had placed her trust in Locke, and now it was up to the human crew to show the Zalathians that there was still hope. As the preparations continued, Locke knew the next few days would be critical. She had one final chance to prove that the old ways of conquest and domination could be left behind, and that the Zalathians could rise from the ashes of their past to build a better future. The day of the public forums had arrived. Tensions were at their highest, and the fate of the Zalathian people rested on the delicate balance of negotiation, trust, and the will to change. The air in the capital was thick with anticipation. The city, which had once been the seat of Zalathian power and pride, now stood on the brink of either total collapse or rebirth. All eyes were on the Queen, on Captain Locke, and on the assembly that had gathered to decide the future. Locke stood with Queen Kira in the observation room, watching as the crowd slowly assembled. The space before them was vast and open, a public square surrounded by towering structures, relics of a bygone era. Below, the opposing factions of Zalathians gathered in groups, some still wearing the ceremonial armor of their military, others in simple garb, their faces a mixture of fear, hope, and defiance. Kira's face was drawn, her posture regal but weary. "They don't trust me, Locke," she said softly, her voice betraying the exhaustion she had carried for so long. "I've led them to ruin. Now, they want to tear everything down. You've done more than anyone else could." "Kira," Locke replied, her gaze fixed on the crowd below. "The fact that they're here listening is proof enough that they're willing to hear you out. Now, it's up to them to decide if they're ready to move forward." Kira's eyes darkened. "They're angry. They feel betrayed. How can I make them see the truth when all they see is a broken empire?" Locke placed a reassuring hand on Kira's shoulder. "It's not about making them see the truth. It's about giving them the opportunity to see it for themselves. You're not alone in this. We're all in this together." With a deep breath, Kira straightened her back. "Then let's begin." The Queen and Locke stepped onto the platform, facing the assembly. The murmurs of the crowd subsided as they saw their leaders appear, the silence becoming deafening. Kira stepped forward, her voice carrying across the square. "I know many of you are angry," she began, her tone firm but measured. "I know you feel betrayed by my decisions. But I am not here to ask for your forgiveness. I am here to ask for your help. We have reached the breaking point. If we continue down this path of division and destruction, we will have nothing left. Our world will be lost, and with it, our future. I cannot do this alone. I need each of you to choose. Do you want to fight for a broken past? Or do you want to fight for a future where we all have a place?" For a moment, the crowd was still, and the silence felt as though it might stretch forever. Then, a voice rose from the back of the assembly. "You want us to bow to your human allies?" it cried, the voice filled with disdain. "You want us to accept their help, to abandon our strength and our legacy? We are Zalathians. We do not need to beg for survival. Locke stepped forward, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. No one is asking you to bow or to abandon your strength, she said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. But your strength has always been built on consumption, on domination. That kind of strength will only destroy you. The humans didn't come to conquer, they came to teach you how to survive. There's a difference. The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, no one responded. Then, to Locke's surprise, a figure stepped out of the crowd. A tall, imposing Zalathian warrior in his prime. His face was hard, his gaze unwavering. He stood before the queen and the human captain, his posture defiant. You speak of survival, the warrior said, his voice rough. But what is survival if we lose ourselves? What is survival if we become subjugated by foreign influence? Locke met his gaze, unflinching. Survival isn't about submission. It's about adaptation. Your world is dying because you refused to adapt. We are offering you a chance to change, to evolve, not to erase who you are. The warrior's expression softened, but the anger still lingered in his eyes. And what if we cannot change? What if we are too far gone? Kira stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Then we will die as we have lived, in pride and in isolation. But we will die as a people, no longer Zalathians, but simply a memory. And if that is what you want, then you may have it. The crowd stirred, some murmuring in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The warrior hesitated, then turned his gaze to Kira. What makes you think this is the way? He asked, his voice quieter now. Kira's face softened, and for the first time, there was a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. Because I have seen what destruction looks like, she replied. I have watched our world crumble, watched my people suffer because we refuse to change. I do not want to lead you into another war, into more bloodshed. I want to build something that lasts. And for that, I need you to trust me. The warrior remained silent, his jaw clenched as he processed her words. Slowly, he turned back to the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the assembly. And if we choose to stand with you, he asked. Then we stand together, Kira answered, her voice unwavering. As one people united not in fear, but in hope. Together we will rebuild. Together we will thrive. A long silence followed, but this time, it was not filled with anger or resistance. It was a silence of contemplation. The warriors, the reformers, and the citizens alike were all considering the queen's words. Then, at last, a voice broke through the quiet. A voice of a young Zalathian woman, her face painted with the colors of the rebel faction. I was born into this world of division, she said, her voice trembling but filled with courage. But I don't want to die in it. If we are to change, then we must change together. There was a ripple through the crowd, a subtle shift, as the people began to speak among themselves. More voices joined in, some hesitant, others filled with conviction. A consensus was beginning to form. Locke glanced at Kira, who was standing tall, her expression filled with a mix of hope and resolve. This was the moment they had been waiting for. As the forum drew to a close, the message was clear. The Zalathian people had chosen a new path. They would rebuild not through domination, but through cooperation. The old guard had not been eradicated, but they had been convinced to lay down their weapons and embrace a future of peace and sustainability. The Queen's leadership had been tested, but it had not been broken. With the hope of the future resting on their shoulders, Locke and her crew watched as the Zalathian people took their first steps into a new era. One where survival was no longer a matter of pride, but of unity. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.